My name's Henry Little. I'm with the Fine Art Group in London. I'm an art advisor. I spend all of my time mainly buying contemporary art, but also a little bit of selling. My focus is modern, post-war and contemporary. I'm an art historian by training. I used to have my own gallery, but now I'm very much on the side of the buyer, and I have to say it suits me down to the ground. I'm delighted to have been invited by Masterpiece to select 5 contemporary pieces from the fair. My first choice today is a work on paper by Barlow. It's called Undercover. It's dated from 2020, so it's a very, very recent work on paper. Barlow is very well known in British contemporary art circles. She's now obviously incredibly well known internationally, but it was not long ago, maybe as recently as 8-10 years ago, that she really burst out onto a much wider scene with a very celebrated show at the Serpentine Gallery. Shortly thereafter, she was represented by Hauser & Wirth, the international mega gallery, and from there her work has only begun to expand and become more ambitious with time. This is a very good example of her work because works on paper have always complemented the sculptural element of her practice. Her style, her aesthetic is defined by a kind of provisionality. Everything is quite rough, it's quite ready. It looks like it's been thrown together, and in some cases it really has. There's a very intuitive, very instinctive way to the manner in which she produces works. And in the early days of her practice, when she wasn't so widely sought after, works were often broken down and the component parts reassembled into new sculptures. However, a work on paper such as this gives you a great way to acquire part of her thought process and to acquire a bit of the Barlow magic. My second pick today is I Can't Let Go by Tracey Emin. It's a relatively recent embroidery work. It depicts a reclining female figure with the words in quite shaky lettering, "I can't let go," immediately above it. Tracey Emin is of course best known for a body of work which is inherently personal. She burst onto the YBA scene in the 1990s, in particular with works which spoke of her own experiences of sex, of relationships, of emotional turmoil, and these have really become the core of her work over the past 30 years. She uses a variety of mediums with very particularly loaded histories. So embroidery is a very, very good example of this, and this is partly why I selected this work, is that her embroidery work speaks very particularly to a feminist art history in which so-called feminine forms of art making and craft making have been employed by artists from the 60s and 70s onwards to speak from a female's perspective with a female voice. A piece like this, again, like the Barlow, we have something which encapsulates the whole world of that artist in a particular object. You have the supine, exposed, vulnerable figure, and we have a very memorable, catchy, dare I say, a catchy piece of text which encapsulates the meaning of the work. And for me personally, the reason I selected this is not only does this work sit especially well within the wider program of the Richard Saltoun Gallery, which focuses on feminist and conceptual practices from the 70s onwards, but it is also a moment of great triumph really for Tracey Emin, not only because she's had a recently very celebrated show, Emin Munch, at the Royal Academy of Arts in London, but also has survived a grueling battle with cancer in which vast swathes of her body have been removed in order to save her life. And there were moments in December, I think, if you're any sort of fan of the YBAs and of Tracey Emin, you held your breath and hoped she was going to come through it. So really, this is part of the reason I selected this. Great work, and we're very, very pleased that Tracey is still with us. My third choice today is Ring W and Ring M by Chinese artist Weiwei. Weiwei has become a global superstar in many ways. He's one of those few artists that has transcended the relatively small world of contemporary art and become something of a popular culture icon. For some people, Weiwei is aestheticizing deeply traumatizing political issues of the day. For others, like myself, he is someone reflecting and presenting a lens on these political issues and engaging a very, very wide audience while also making us think about the history of these political issues. So the current object is another case in point. Here we have 2 24-karat gold rings. These gold rings are a recent return to making jewelry that the artist is particularly fond of. Each of them is adorned with very typical Ai Weiwei imagery. So on the one hand, we're looking at something which is visually similar to an Egyptian hieroglyphic, but on the other hand is very similar to other infographics and contemporary imagery. The figures he's using are generally from either particular migrant routes across the Mediterranean, so they're figures in boats, or they're people moving in some way. Weiwei is inherently interested in movement of people from areas of conflict, from areas of poverty to areas of affluence. He's interested in all of the inequalities which are part and parcel of these very traumatizing and challenging journeys. So here we have an object which is using figures which are obviously speaking about migrants and the movement of people and very current political issues, but this has been perfectly married to a form that is deeply resonant with archaeological and art historical meaning. My fourth choice today is Pain Relief, 2019 by Ibrahim ElSalihi, and it's brought to the fair by Viga Gallery. ElSalihi was born in Sudan. He studied in London and then returned to Sudan and set up what's known as the School of Khartoum, a modernist style of painting that has since become greatly respected, greatly revered, and is most memorably now included in the Tate Modern collection. He was also the first African artist to have a solo retrospective at Tate Modern in 2013. If we look at the present work, Pain Relief, we can begin to unpack some of the influences and some of the ingredients which make up his very memorable style. Given his age, he's now unfortunately suffering from numerous chronic back conditions, sciatica, and other things which render him chairbound. The present title, Pain Relief, is a reflection of exactly this circumstance. He's talked about how these works are the direct consequence of using drawing to cope with pain, to cope with these chronic illnesses. So he speaks of art itself as a kind of pain relief. The other interesting thing about this work is that although originally conceived on a small scale on medicine packets, Pain Relief, it has been expanded to a much larger scale to become more of a monumental scale work. This is done through the use of silkscreen printing. So once the original image is conceived, it can then be expanded and blown up to be printed on a large canvas. So in effect, with a work like this, again, you have a whole microcosm of the artist's practice. We have a full-length figure, it's on canvas, so it's almost like a painting. It is a mixture of all of the different styles and references that are so typical of his work, but is also speaking very particularly to his current situation and his current biography. My fifth and final choice for today is a piece called David Landau Seated by Frank Auerbach, and it's Oil on Board. Auerbach's Gallery Marlborough have worked with him for many, many decades. They are still working with him, and new work is still coming from the studio. It's quite remarkable for a man of his age, north of 90. This piece is, again, a classic example of his work. David Landau is one of his best-known sitters. He's an arts patron who has been friends with Auerbach and a sitter with Auerbach for many, many, many years. There's an inherent depth and warmth to their relationship, which is absolutely essential to the relationship between artist and sitter. Auerbach is known for a very, very heavy use of impasto. In some paintings, the paint itself even becomes an almost sculptural element. It adds an incredible tactility, an incredible texture to the surface of the work. The one thing you will also be certain to always see in an Auerbach painting is brushstrokes. Plenty and plenty of visual brushstrokes. This size, this is again a classic kind of scale for Auerbach. Classic sitter. You couldn't really ask for much more from a work by Auerbach. I highly recommend it.